Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to North Shore. My name is Scotty Scruggs. I'm the pastor here, and I'm really glad that you're here this weekend, whether you're in this room with us today or if you're joining us online. We're excited that you're joining us wherever you're joining us from. And as you just heard in that video, we're in our final week of what we call Giving Tree. And we've had a great start so far. Just so you know, over 1,000 kids have been sponsored so far, which is amazing. And that means we have over 500 still to go, and we don't want to miss any. And this is the last week to really dive into this. So if you haven't jumped in, haven't sponsored, this is a week to do it. You can sponsor 1, 2, 4, 10, however many you feel called to do. The ornaments are still in the tree, and it's $25 that can change the life of a kid, a family in need this Christmas. And every dollar you give to Giving Tree goes to making Christmas specials for these families who are in need. So can we commit to finishing strong around this one as well? Yeah. But as you know, today is the last day of Thanksgiving weekend this year. And one of the things that I've kind of learned about Thanksgiving is that people tend to have really strong preferences when it comes to the Thanksgiving menu. Anyone else have opinions about Thanksgiving food? Yep. So I thought we could have a little fun with this and just kind of have a little poll to figure out where everybody stands when it comes to Thanksgiving dinner. So you can just raise your hand when I ask the question, or you can actually type in the comments online as well. But question, how many of you are team turkey? Raise your hand. How many are part of team ham? Okay, team ham, we have people that can pray for you after the service because, obviously it's got to be turkey. How about this one? How many of you are team stuffing? How about team dressing? How many of you don't know the difference? I clearly don't know. I just put up the same picture. I have no idea what the difference is, so we'll just kind of run with that. How about this one? How many are team fresh cranberries? How about team canned cranberries? I don't know. There's just something about the can shape with the little ridges around it. It just tells me it's Thanksgiving, but that's just me. How about this one? How many of you are team sweet potatoes? How about team mashed potatoes? How many of you take all the potatoes? Like you're just like potatoes. It's time to carb load at Thanksgiving because tomorrow there'll be more Thanksgiving leftovers to eat. How about this one? Dessert. How about team pumpkin pie? Yeah, a lot of hands. How about team pecan pie? How many of you will just take pie? Because it's been a long year, you want pie. Okay, last one. How many of you are just over the whole Thanksgiving thing and you want pizza for Thanksgiving? Any hands? Anyone have pizza this year? There's a few hands out there. It's actually an alternative if you want to go that way. Either way, regardless of your Thanksgiving preferences, we're really glad that you're here. Everybody's welcome at North Shore. And it kind of takes us into this series that we've been in the last few weeks, which is called How to Stand For What You Believe In. And the reason we're doing this is because it's really a contrast to what's kind of really common in our day. People are right now all about how to stand against what they believe in. And it's whoever the they is to you. The they could be liberals. The they could be conservatives. It could be people who have a different lifestyle or belief system from you. And we have this attitude in our day where it feels like we have to be against them. You know, they're threatening our way of life. They're threatening our values. So how do we battle against them, take the war to them? How do we be against them? But what we've been talking about for the past few weeks, that's not your job. Your job is to learn how to stand for what you believe in. And to do this in a way that points people to God and not away from Him. And we've been in this series that's kind of all about that. In fact, one of the best examples of this in the Bible is this Old Testament book called Daniel, which is what we've been kind of walking through this past month. Remember, Daniel's story takes place when God's people, the Israelites, are living in exile in this foreign nation called Babylon. Remember, Babylon came and conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and basically took away everything the Israelites held dear. And all this happened when Daniel was just a teenager. He was taken and trained to serve this foreign Babylonian king, King Nebuchadnezzar. And after training for 3 years, he was so much wiser and stronger than all the other guys, King Nebuchadnezzar made him like his number 2 guy, his top advisor. And then 3 years became 5 years, became 10 years, became 20 years, became almost 40 years of serving this one king, Nebuchadnezzar. But then Nebuchadnezzar died. And Daniel went through a number of new bosses. And these aren't all listed in the Bible, so I thought it'd be good to do a little history lesson and kind of walk through them. These are kind of some interesting names. Nebuchadnezzar was followed by a king named Amel Marduk, who was followed by a king named Neriglissar, who was followed by a guy named Labashi Marduk. And if you think it's hard to find Christmas stockings for your kids' names, try going to a store to find these. I mean, these are definitely going to be out of stock, okay? And he was just king for just a few months before a guy named Nabonidus became king. But he didn't want to stay in Babylon, so he actually kind of left to go live in this Arabian oasis, and he installed kind of a surrogate king, a guy named Belshazzar, who you can read about in Daniel 5. You kind of know more about this guy. And he ruled for about 15 years until Babylon was conquered by a Persian king named Cyrus the Great. Now, historically, this matters because when Cyrus invaded, that would mark the end of the Babylonian Empire. Like, they are no more. Now it's the Persian Empire, and they would stay in place until Alexander the Great from Greece came and kind of conquered the whole world. But when Cyrus ruled, you might know about him in the Bible because he was the king who allowed the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So he's looked upon quite favorably in the Bible. But in his first few years, he also installed kind of a surrogate leader, a surrogate king, a guy named Darius the Mede. Now, why am I boring you with all of this history? Because by the time we get to the story in Daniel's life that we're looking at today, a lot of time has gone by. In fact, over 60 years has passed since Daniel was first taken into exile, meaning he's no longer the young, athletic, young adult he used to be. He's now between 80 and 85 years old, which isn't always the picture you have when you think of Daniel, right? And after spending all those years as the number 2 guy, for the last 20 years, it was kind of the opposite. He sort of drifted into political obscurity. Maybe he did the whole speaker circuit thing for a while. Maybe he was a guest lecturer at the University of Babylon. We don't know what he was doing. All we know is that by the time Belshazzar was in power, he had never even heard of Daniel. In fact, when he meets Daniel, he says to him, hey, I heard you're the guy who used to be the guy who's no longer the guy. That's kind of what he said. And then in Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar promotes Daniel back into leadership, but then he dies that very night, and Darius the Mede, King Darius, becomes kind of the new boss. Which brings us to the story we're going to read today, Daniel chapter 6. You can follow along here on the screen. Text says that it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps. Now, that just meant like a regional governor in sort of a different kind of province of Babylon. So 120 new provincial governors to rule throughout the kingdom with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. Now, these satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. This means their job is to balance the budget, because somebody's got to do it, right? Someone's got to balance the budget. Okay, we won't go into that one. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So Daniel is kind of back in leadership. He's back on top. Why? Well, not just because of his exceptional qualities, which are mentioned here, but also because Daniel was still there. Think about it. He was still there. He was still involved. He was still engaged. He was still somewhere down the chain in the king's service. In other words, Daniel stayed. He stayed. Through all those different kings, through all the ups and downs, even as he drifted into sort of political obscurity, he stayed while the rest of God's people basically moved out of town. And we know this is true because archaeologists have actually discovered Babylonian inscriptions from that era that prove that most of the Israelites lived as kind of a group together outside of the urban center of Babylon. So they kind of had this holy huddle outside, away from all the shrines and idols and temples and sanctuaries. And they didn't just keep to themselves, they harbored all this anger and resentment against Babylon. And we know this is true because they actually wrote it down and sang songs about it. This is actually an excerpt from Psalm 137 that was written while the Israelites were in Babylon, in exile. And this is like one of their prayers. This is what they said. They said, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion or Israel. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. I mean, this is in the Bible. This is how angry, how bitter, how resentful they were. And it's why they tried to live and do life as far away from Babylon or the urban center of Babylon as they could. And here's why this matters. This matters because it's possible, even in our day, for the same sort of separatist, resentful spirit to emerge in God's people. I believe it's actually happening again in the church today. We're seeing a similar kind of bitterness and resentment, maybe not quite so raw as in this text, but a bitterness and separatism happening in the church today. People are saying, because I've heard these stories, I've had it with the politics, the school systems, the masks, the mandates, and so they leave. They leave their church. They leave their community. They move out of state even. I'm hearing stories like that. And let me just say, I get it, like at an emotional level, like I get it. I was actually just traveling in Phoenix a few weeks ago, and I thought to myself, wow, I could do ministry here. There's no masks, no mandates. It was like 90 degrees and sunny in November. Amen? It's like I could see myself, right? So I understand the temptation to want to get out. And just so you know, there are examples in church history of God's people pursuing holiness through what I would call a season of separation from the culture around them, like in a sincere way. Some of you know the historical examples like the Desert Fathers of the 3rd century, or the monastic movement in the Middle Ages, or the Puritans in early America. But I believe what we're seeing in the church today is different. I'm not seeing people who are passionately seeking a deeper form of holiness. I'm seeing a kind of newly formed religious separatism, which isn't just about separating from bad people. It's about separating from the people who haven't separated from the bad people. Do you see what I'm saying? It's Christians labeling and turning against other Christians, not over the claims of Jesus, but over politics and masks and mandates and stuff like that. And that's not how God calls his people to live. And I know because at the core of Daniel's story is this amazing, simple, often missed reality that Daniel stayed. Even when he got demoted, even when he lost his influence, even when Babylon kept acting like Babylon, he wasn't out there, out of the city with all the rest of the Israelites. He understood that transformation can't happen at a distance. You got to stay close. You got to lean in. You got to be involved. And you have to think of yourself not as a victim of the surrounding culture, but a witness to it, even when it's hard. And Daniel remained committed to that for over 60 years in Babylon until he was over 80 years old. He stayed. He stayed. And then when Darius came to power, it looked like, at least for a moment, like he was back on top. Things were turning around. Because see, like any new CEO, he's trying to fix the company problems. Darius does this kind of massive company-wide reorg. He appoints 120 new administrators, a management team of 3, and Daniel's going to be at the top. By the way, have any of you ever been part of like a company-wide reorg, maybe where you work? Yeah? They can be kind of messy, right? Some people get promoted, others get kind of bumped down. Some roles get eliminated altogether. So we shouldn't be surprised that some of the guys who get passed over for some of those promotions are a little jealous of Daniel. Let's look at what happens. The text says, at this reorg, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And this means Daniel never compromised. He never traded his integrity to get one step up on the ladder. And these guys, they were looking. They checked his phone records, they checked his files, they checked his emails. They were looking for something, and they couldn't find anything. No corruption, no negligence, nothing, because Daniel stayed, and he never caved. He didn't just stay, he never caved. And just think about all the opportunities he would have had to make little, seemingly innocent or harmless compromises in his life. To say things like, I'll just not report that part of my income. It's just a little thing. I'll just kind of conceal that part of the truth. It's just a little thing. I'll just flirt a little bit with that married woman over there. It's just a little thing. But here's the thing about little things that I've learned. They're never just little things. Because, and many of you know this, every little compromise makes the next one easier and a bigger one look smaller, right? I mean, every little compromise in your life, it makes the next one seem easier to do and a bigger one look even smaller, like it's not a big deal. Tell one lie and the next one's a lot easier to tell. Gossip about one person and it's easier to jump into the next round. Kind of dabble with lust, and it's easy for that to become more of a pattern in your life. And then 20 years later, these little decisions have become massive problems. And some of you have experienced this very thing in your life, or maybe you're walking through it right now. But Daniel understood your choices matter more than your opinions. And it's so important in Babylon, where it feels so important to have the right opinion and broadcast the right opinion and post and share the right opinions. I mean, we are an opinion-obsessed world right now, where it feels so important to share the right opinion about politics or church or God or COVID or whatever. But did you know God doesn't really care that much about whether or not you have all the right opinions? God cares a lot more about whether or not you're becoming the right kind of person. And that's all about your choices. That's about what you do. That's about how you're allowing God's grace to work itself out in your everyday life. Your choices matter more than your opinions. And not only that, your integrity matters more than your influence. And it can be hard to believe this because we live, again, in an influencer-driven kind of world, don't we? Question for you. When the world around looks at the American church today, do you think they see a people who are hungry for holiness or people who are desperate for influence? Because I think we're becoming more and more desperate for influence and power, as if that's going to solve all the problems in our world. I have literally heard politicians tell audiences of Christians, your faith is being attacked, your values are being threatened, but if you vote for me, you will have power. And we fall for it. On both sides of the aisle. Here's the thing. Jesus never said, if you want to change the world, you should become an influencer. He said, if you want to change the world, love your neighbor. Forgive your enemies. Honor your spouse. Keep your commitments. Share your wealth. In other words, your integrity matters more than your influence. It may not seem this way. The world won't tell you this, but your integrity matters more. And I know this is true because Jesus modeled this for us. I mean, think about it. The people around him wanted to make him king. They were saying, let's get this guy into political office so we can have our values at the forefront. We can live the way we want to live. Let's put him into office. But Jesus didn't take that path. In fact, he withdrew. When they came from to make him king, he withdrew away because he took the path of greater integrity, greater generosity, greater love, greater sacrifice. And then when they came to accuse him, guess what? They could find no corruption in him at all either, right? No corruption. And so they had to kind of come up with something. So they accused him of treason against Rome. And it's so interesting, something very similar happens in Daniel's life. When those jealous leaders couldn't find a way to accuse him, they could find nothing wrong in his life, they came up with a plan to make him look like a traitor. Look what the text says. It says, so these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. You got to start with a little brown nosing just to kind of get the ball rolling, right? The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed. And by the way, they didn't come together and agree. This was sort of a little plot. They're just making this part up. But they say they've all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, so one caveat, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. So just to sum up, Daniel stayed. He never caved. And I wish I could tell you that meant all of his problems went away, right? We would want this to be the third point, right? But it never happens that way. In fact, when you stand for what you believe in, when you stand for like what you believe in life, when you make Jesus a priority, sometimes you're going to end up with more problems, not less. And just so you know, other people aren't the problem here. The enemy, the devil, is the real problem here. The Apostle Paul says, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. You see, you have a spiritual enemy, and his goal is to get you to blend in or check out. And if you don't, he's going to come after you. Because, and you know this, if you choose to be faithful, you're going to be a target. When you choose to be faithful, you're going to be a target. The enemy will come at you with all sorts of schemes, whether it's obstacles at work or problems with family or financial challenges or sexual temptation, all to try to distract you or discourage you or derail you. And I'm telling you this because you need to know that it's coming. You need to know that this happens. And when it does, it's not because God wants you to suffer, it's because he wants you to matter. He actually wants you to live a life that counts. Now, just so you know, this doesn't mean we should go out and aim to be offensive so that people will oppose us. Some Christians will experience opposition not because they're faithful, but because they're arrogant or self-righteous or stuff like that. So just because you're being opposed doesn't automatically mean you're being faithful. But if you choose to be faithful, you're going to be a target. Just like Daniel was a target. And so his enemies went out and they set this trap for him. They persuaded the king to enact this new law that says no one can pray to their God for 30 days. So what's Daniel going to do now? Let's see. It says, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows were open towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Meaning, Daniel stayed, he never caved, and he prayed. He stayed, he never caved. And the next step, like the next spiritual giant, like the act of courage that he had to do was to get on his knees and just pray. And not silently with his eyes open so no one could tell me. That's what I would have done. I would have found a way to, I'm going to pray, but no one's going to notice. I'll just be driving along, kind of praying in my car, eyes open. No one has to know that I'm praying. But not Daniel. He prays with the windows open to Jerusalem because that's what God called his people who were living in exile to do. 1 Kings 8:48, you can look it up. And notice, Daniel didn't pray and then ask God for wisdom or protection. Instead, what does he do? He gives thanks to God, which if I'm honest, would have been like the last thing on my mind in this moment. I mean, my first response in a situation like this would have been, God, why'd you let this happen? Like I've been faithful and serving you and obedient, and now this is happening. Like, why did you let this happen? Don't you see all I'm doing for you? Which is exactly how the enemy wants you to respond. Because here's the thing, if the enemy can't tempt you to compromise, he'll tempt you to complain. And we are living in a day where people are falling victim to this, falling into this trap all the time. I feel it, I hear it. I mean, just the lines, I can't deal with the masks anymore. I can't deal with the government anymore. I can't deal with these problems anymore. And just so you know, I'm tired of living through all this as well. Like, I'm tired of wearing a mask. I'm tired of making my 4-year-old wear a mask. Like, I feel like complaining about this all the time. But when I read Daniel's story, I just can't help but notice he doesn't complain about his circumstances or blame another person once in the whole story. In over 60 years. And then here, when he's facing the greatest challenge of his life, he doesn't start even with a request. He gives thanks to God. Why? Because he understands what real gratitude is about. He understands that gratitude, next slide. Gratitude isn't a response to what you have. It's a response to who's in charge. Gratitude isn't just a response to what you have. That's kind of the way our culture thinks about gratitude. Gratitude really is a response to who's in charge. And guess what? The president isn't in charge, the governor's not in charge, the mayor's not in charge, you're not in charge, I'm not in charge. God is in charge. And he's still in charge. And so Daniel does the one thing that makes sense to do. He gets down on his knees and says, God, I'm so thankful you're still on the throne. I'm so thankful you're stronger than lions. I'm so thankful that with you I have nothing I need to fear. And by the way, if you're wondering why Daniel can be grateful in a moment like this, it isn't because he's more courageous than you and me, it's because he's been more consistent. I mean, think about it. This wasn't just a one-off moment of prayer for Daniel. He didn't spend the last 20 years just doing his thing and going along, and then a moment of crisis comes, and suddenly like he's down on his knees praying. That's how we might pray, but not Daniel. The text says he got down on his knees to pray what? Just as he had done before. And the day before that, and the day before that, and the day before that. In other words, Daniel stayed. He never caved. He prayed every day. Every day. For over 60 years. Through all the kings, through all the ups and downs, all the highs and lows. Daniel understood this really important truth that the courage to stand starts with the decision to kneel. The courage to stand in your life, whatever the moment may be, it starts with the decision to kneel. And not just once in a while or when life gets hard, but day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, in this almost mundane routine, every day, I'm deciding to kneel. I'm grateful to God because He's still on the throne. There's a pastor and writer named Eugene Peterson who has a great phrase for this. He calls this kind of lifestyle a long obedience in the same direction. Isn't that great? A long obedience in the same direction. And he kind of writes about it. He says this. He says, millions of people make decisions for Christ, but there's a dreadful attrition rate. Many claim to have been born again, but the evidence for Christian discipleship is slim. There is a great market for religious experience in our world. There is little enthusiasm for the patient acquisition of virtue. Little inclination to sign up for a long apprenticeship in what earlier generations of Christians called holiness. Why? Because we'd rather have powerful religious experiences. I know at times I would. We'd rather go to church and get a weekly dose of amazing music or a really deep sermon. And there's nothing wrong with amazing music or a really deep sermon, but that's not what grows your faith. What grows your faith is trusting God every day in simple, mundane, ordinary, not impressive, not Instagrammable kind of ways. Like when you're short on cash, or when you're arguing with your spouse, or when you're dealing with chronic pain, or when your kids are driving you crazy, or when your in-laws are visiting for Thanksgiving. Long before Daniel ever faced the lions, he was faithful with the little stuff. He stayed, he never caved, and he prayed every day. And that brings us to the part of the story that many of you know so well. Even though the king didn't want to execute Daniel, the law was the law. And so the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually. See, even the king knew this was a daily regiment for Daniel. May the God whom you serve continually rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. At first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. Where he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, as if we had forgotten. This is the main point of the story. Has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? And he didn't expect to hear a thing. People don't used to survive in a night with hungry lions. But he heard a voice. Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of those lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. And the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from that den, no wound was found on him because he trusted in his God. In other words, friends, God is faithful when you trust him. God is faithful when you trust him in your marriage and in your work and with your finances and with your family and with your career goals and in your dating life. God is faithful when you trust him. When you make that decision not to serve him periodically or occasionally or just on Sunday, but continually. And the hard part is sometimes we don't see or experience the fruit of this kind of trust for a long time. And you know this, right? You know this in your life. You don't feel like it's working for you or doing anything. I mean, it wasn't until Daniel was over 80 years old and was suddenly thrown into crisis that he fully understood, oh, this is why I've been praying every day. And so that this moment with the lions isn't even a decision. It's not even hard. I just have a habit. I know what I'm going to do. God was faithful. Some of you know the name George Muller. He was a 19th century educator and Christian missionary. He cared for over 10,000 orphans in his lifetime and established 127 schools that impacted over 120,000 students. An amazing life. But my favorite story about his life is something much less flashy and noticeable. It's about when he decided, when he was about 40 years old, to pray for 5 of his friends, 5 close friends, that he wanted to come to know Jesus. So he made a decision that he was going to pray for each one of those 5 friends every single day. And at first, God was kind of moving. One of them came to know Jesus after just 1 year. And then another one came to know Jesus after 5 years. And then another one after 6 years. So things are kind of rolling and God's been faithful. But then there was kind of a dry spell. Not for a year or 5 years or 10 years, but for 52 years. But he kept praying every day up until the day he died when he was 92 years old. Still believing God would be faithful, even after not seeing any fruit, any evidence, any signs for 52 years. And guess what? God was faithful. How do I know? Because those other 2 friends came to know Jesus just a few months after he died. Because here's the thing, God is always faithful when we trust him. In those simple, everyday, ordinary ways. The question is, will you keep praying? Will you keep trusting even when you can't see it? Because when we trust God this way, it's not only that he grows our faith and gives us courage to face the lions, God can use that kind of faith. He can use that kind of courage in the lives of other people. And that's exactly what happened in Daniel's story. After the king saw Daniel's faith and God's faithfulness to him, he issued this new decree that the God of Israel is the only God that should be worshiped. He actually used these amazing words. This is the king saying this. He says, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth, and he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. I mean, can you even imagine in our day a governor saying this, a president saying this? Can you even imagine? More importantly, can you even imagine that cynical friend of yours saying this? That skeptical family member saying this? Because this is what God wants. This is where all this leads. God wants that friend, that family member, that neighbor to look at your life and realize there is a God and he's stronger than lions. But how can they know if God's people are always compromising or blaming or complaining? How can they know if God's people are willing to trade integrity for influence? How can they know if God's people think being faithful means being quick to leave rather than called to stay? Answer? They can't. But Daniel shows us that a life of ordinary faith can have an extraordinary impact on others. See, it's really interesting. We don't know a lot about Daniel's life after this moment. But we do know that centuries later, when Jesus was born, the people who came to worship him weren't from Jerusalem or the temple. Remember who they were? They were wise men from where? From Babylon. From the east. And they didn't come to forbid worship. They came to kneel in worship. I'd say that's quite a legacy in Babylon. But to have this kind of impact on Babylon, it takes a daily commitment. I'm going to honor my spouse every day. I'm going to refuse to gossip every day. I'm going to guard my thoughts every day. I'm going to spend time with God every day. And if you're wondering, like I am, like how do I do that? Like I'm not Daniel, I'm just me. I'm living this kind of messy, busy, complicated life. It's hard to figure out. Well, here's the answer. You can't do this on your own, but there's a God who can help you. And he promises to deliver you and protect you and uphold you no matter what cave you may find yourself in. And that's really the take-home lesson of the book of Daniel, is that Daniel stayed. He never caved. He prayed every day until when? Until that stone was rolled away. That's the promise. And by the way, does this sound familiar to anyone else in the room? See, what happened in Daniel's life happened 700 years later when the Son of God came into the world, and he didn't come to blend in or check out. Jesus stayed, and he never caved, and he prayed every day until the stone was rolled away. And that's why we can stay in Babylon. That's why we can love our neighbors. That's why we can forgive our enemies, because the stone has been rolled away, and the tomb is empty, and God has shut the mouths of the devil and his angels, and he can deliver you out of whatever cave you're in. But it starts with your decision today to stay and never cave and pray every day until your stone is rolled away. Because friends, that's how you stand for what you believe in. And so we're going to close by doing what Daniel did every single day. We're going to give thanks to God, not just for what we have, but for who is in charge. So would you pray with me? Jesus, the courage to stand starts with right now our decision to kneel, to come before you as the God who is still on the throne, even in Babylon. And regardless of whether we feel like we're on top of the world or we're lost in obscurity somewhere, you are in charge. The stone has been rolled away. The tomb is empty. You've conquered sin and death and the evil one. And you called us now to be on our knees, faithfully living out your life and your mission and your love and your generosity and your sacrifice to all who are in Babylon. And whether we see fruit from it today or whether it takes 52 years or more, we want to commit right now to stay and never cave and be on our knees every day, trusting you until that stone is rolled away again and you return and all is made right. And then we'll know for sure, then the world will know that you are a God who rescues and saves, that there's no other name like yours, Jesus. There's no power, there's no ruler, there's no kingdom like yours. And so we celebrate and sing that in worship today, on our knees, our hearts postured in worship before you now. God, thank you. And we pray this in your name. And everybody said, amen.